So in September 2015, the FARC and the Colombian government finally agreed to sign a final peace deal by the 23rd of March 2016. This follows 3 years of negotiations between both sides, and it's hoped that it will bring an end to the 50 years of fighting that's affected Colombia. There is plenty of reason to be optimistic that these peace talks will finally be agreed upon for several reasons. The first is the political will on both sides to actually achieve peace. Now, although this sounds simplistic, it nonetheless is important to emphasise that both sides do want to achieve this peace deal. President Juan Manuel Santos has essentially staked his presidency on achieving this peace deal, so his reputation and the whole of his time in office is at stake. There's a lot of pressure on him. And the FARC has consistently come back to the negotiating table time and time again. This is despite making accusations against the Colombian military with regards to fighting against the FARC, and also calling off ceasefires on several occasions. But time and time again it has come back and it's resumed peace talks and it's furthered the peace talks. Therefore, that demonstrates how much both sides want to achieve this final peace deal. A good example of this occurred earlier in 2015. In April, the FARC launched an attack on the Colombian army, killing 17 soldiers in a large-scale ambush. This attack was essentially born out of frustration at not achieving a bilateral ceasefire with the Colombian government. The Colombian government then responded by resuming airstrikes on the FARC and resuming operations against them. This then resulted in a summer of escalated attacks by the FARC. There was a high frequency of attacks and they were spread out across the country. But this culminated in the September agreement to reach a final peace deal. And what I hope this demonstrates is, again, how much both sides want to achieve this final peace deal. This particular episode in the summer was actually the most fraught time during the whole entire peace talks, over 3 years. This was the point where it seemed if they were going to end, this was it. The fact that both sides managed to go through this escalation of violence and still agree on reaching a final deal demonstrates the political will. The second reason to be optimistic is that both sides have essentially agreed on the majority of agendas on the peace deal, or at least partially agreed on all of those issues. The first one is agricultural reform, which essentially is land ownership and rural reform, political participation for the FARC, the illegal drugs trade, and victim rights. So the fact that the majority of the issues have been agreed upon is again a reason to be optimistic. There's no particular issues as to why the peace talks shouldn't be finalised. Thirdly, both sides have been cooperating outside of the peace talks. Earlier in 2015, both sides actually partook in an operation to clear landmines from fields under FARC control in Meta Department and Antioquia Department. This was unprecedented to see photographs of senior FARC commanders alongside army officers involved in an operation to clear landmines. However, there are some issues that we need to be wary about with regards to everything being agreed upon. The first thing is the final agreement on the agenda issues is how to actually bring the conflict to an end and how to implement the peace process. None of this has actually been agreed upon, and this is obviously a huge issue as to how things will actually end. For example, the FARC has agreed, in theory, that it will disarm 60 days after a final deal is agreed upon. But the issue with this is the actual logistics of how this would work have yet to be agreed upon. Likewise, there's been no security guarantees for demobilised FARC fighters, which is clearly something that needs to be addressed in case there's a resumption of arms or in case there's any retaliatory attacks against the FARC. Finally, there was a public announcement on transitional justice. This is essentially was the hardest area to agree upon between both sides. Now, while this announcement has been made and both sides have agreed upon it, the finer details have yet to be made public, and therefore it brings into debate have they actually been agreed upon. For example, the actual definitions of criminal terms have yet to be agreed upon. So there's been talk about community sentences, being passed, but what that entails, community service, what does that mean? It hasn't been agreed upon. Likewise, there's been talk of FARC fighters who are convicted of crimes being held in secure locations, but again, the definition of that has yet to be agreed upon. This is a potential issue for two reasons. First of all, because the Colombian population are likely going to want some sentences to be passed because there's a lot of resentment towards FARC activity. Thousands of civilians have died. So that's an issue because the Colombian government are going to need to pass some punishments to appease any public resentment. Secondly, the FARC have made clear time and time again they will not tolerate any of their fighters being sent to prison. So again, when these legal terms are decided upon, that's something to consider, that the FARC have basically deemed this almost non-negotiable. They will not tolerate fighters being imprisoned. If peace is to be achieved, this will obviously be fabulous for Colombia, and particularly with regards to tourism and the economy. But there does remain potential issues in a post-FARC society. The first one is you have to bear in mind the possibility of anti-talks FARC factions emerging. So while the FARC is a very unified militant group, and as far as we're aware, they're very pro-talks, all of the fighters involved, the FARC fronts operate independently across the territory that they control. So there is always potential that a certain front won't agree with the peace talks and may not agree with pursuing a peace deal. There's also a big danger that former FARC fighters may actually join criminal gangs after the peace deal as demobilised fighters. This is in part because the FARC has funded its operations through a variety of criminal activities, and it basically is in charge of criminal enterprises. The biggest ones of these are, of course, the drug trafficking, kidnapping, there may be pipe theft, extortion of small businesses. These are issues that need to be considered. So the irony is that although terrorism is likely to decrease following a peace deal, criminal violence is likely to increase, in part because you're going to have thousands of FARC fighters who are used to profiting from criminal enterprises no longer being able to do that under this peace agreement. So the likelihood is they'll either join existing gangs or form their own criminal gangs to partake in these activities. The Colombian police, however, would be well versed to deal with an uptake in criminal violence, in large part because it's a centralised police force that's used to dealing with these type of criminal activities. However, one of the issues that exists is these operations would likely take part in FARC-controlled territory, coca operations, coca production. These operations take place in the jungle where there's been little state presence, and to be honest, it's unlikely that there'll be a state presence there after a peace deal. With the FARC's absent, there is of course a risk of left-wing armed groups developing. This is in part because the FARC has been involved in protecting rural rights, peasant rights, rural reform, land rights. In the absence of the FARC, there does raise a risk that left-wing groups or those with left-wing sympathies will actually take up arms in order to reclaim land themselves. The only way to counteract this is if President Santos responds quickly to the rural land reforms that he's promised in the peace deal, and he can address those problems. Likewise, as a consequence of that, there's the risk of right-wing armed groups forming, either drug traffickers or right-wing paramilitaries, to defend the land from such left-wing groups. So again, it's a risk of violence within a rural territory. In the past, FARC militants have been targeted by right-wing paramilitaries, as have members of the Patriotic Union Party, which was a FARC-linked political party. There raises a risk that this will happen again in the future because of the right-wing paramilitaries wanting revenge or retaliation against the FARC. However, there is promise within that because the right-wing paramilitaries do not exist in the same networks on a large scale as they previously did. An example of this is the fact that this year, Patriotic Union members were able to participate in the elections and not one was assassinated. The reason that's important is because between 1985 and 2002, at least 3,000 Patriotic Union members were assassinated by suspected right-wing paramilitaries. The fact that that hasn't happened this year is something to be optimistic about because it implies that the FARC will be able to take part politically without fear of retribution from these right-wing paramilitaries. Another issue is the fact that FARC political participation, although agreed upon, is by no means guaranteed. An example of this is in November in 2015, the Colombian Senate actually banned former FARC fighters who have demobilised from partaking in politics. This is a huge issue because if this isn't passed, it does potentially threaten the peace talks. Because if the FARC is not allowed to be involved politically, there's no incentive for it not to try and take up arms again in order to push through its Marxist ideology. Another issue to consider is potential army and defence cuts. Of course, if violence decreases with a FARC peace deal, it raises the question of what to do about a huge army, a huge budget that's spent on that. The Finance Minister and the Defence Minister have both made promises that this won't be affected, in large part because there'll be a payoff from tourism opening up, so the Colombian government will earn a lot of revenue from that, and also because security is still going to be an important issue in the months and years after the peace deal. But nonetheless, it does raise a question about what to do with such a large army surplus. President Santos has suggested the creation of a roaming rural police unit, much like the gendarmes of France, which would be one way of counteracting any potential redundancies or budget cuts. There's an assumption that if a peace deal with the FARC and the Colombian government can be agreed upon, then so too can a peace agreement between the ELN and the Colombian government. The reason for this is the ELN, like the FARC, is a Marxist revolutionary militant group. And so people are suggesting that you can transfer this peace deal onto the ELN. But that's a rather simplistic way of looking at it, and there's lots of reasons to believe that this won't happen. The first one is the ELN is ideologically much more hardline than the FARC, which therefore makes negotiations harder to achieve. For example, the FARC used to adopt the same revolutionary ideology which called for the overthrow of the government, but in recent years it's kind of moderated its position somewhat and is pushing for reform, which is what we've seen in the peace talks. The ELN, however, is still pushing for this revolutionary ideology, and therefore it's going to make peace talks much more difficult. The second point to consider is the ELN is militarily much smaller and much less capable than the FARC. So again, there's less incentive for the government to bend over backwards to achieve peace with it. And this is something that needs to be considered because the FARC has always been a threat to stability in Colombia, sometimes more, sometimes less. But it's very much been a threat, whereas the ELN, most of their operations have been restricted to small IED attacks, attacks on pipelines, so the threat isn't as great. Thirdly, the Colombian government will not want to jeopardise peace with the FARC by potentially offering something to the ELN that it refused to offer the FARC. Bearing in mind the ELN is more hardline, this is a real risk that they'll push for more than what the FARC achieved. And quite simply, the Colombian government is not going to jeopardise peace with the FARC because that's its main priority because of the threat the group has posed over all these years. The fourth issue as well is time and time again, the Colombian government has made very clear to the ELN that it will not engage in peace talks until they stop kidnapping people and until they release all their hostages. And the ELN has kept pushing and pushing for peace talks, and the Colombian government has said, no, this is a prerequisite. And although the ELN has released some hostages, it's still kidnapping people. So until it stops that, the Colombian government has no reason to then sit at the negotiating table and agree a deal with them. The ELN has made clear that it wants to achieve peace talks with the Colombian government. In October in 2015, it did a large-scale attack that took a lot of people by surprise. They killed 12 Colombian soldiers in Boyacá department and allegedly took 2 others hostage. Now, this attack to me, it's obvious that this is the ELN trying to push for peace talks. It's trying to force the Colombian government to the negotiating table. And the reason I say this is because this is a tactic the FARC used time and time again in 3 years of peace talks. Whenever it couldn't get its own way, it would do a large-scale attack or increase attacks, and suddenly there'd be an agreement passed or, just more progress being made. It didn't work all the time, but the majority of the time it did. And the example I gave you earlier in April is kind of proof of that. So it does seem that the ELN is trying its hardest to force put peace talks through. However, I don't believe it has the capability to carry out such large-scale attacks on a long-term basis. Unless it can, it seems unlikely this will convince the Colombian government to sit down and negotiate with them. If they're able to pursue attacks like this on a long-term scale, like the FARC, maybe so. But bearing in mind the ELN is militarily smaller, it's less capable, and it operates in a much smaller territory than the FARC, it seems unlikely they can continue to do this on a long-term basis.